So in the first third of Blanchette's Porkopolis, you get a pretty good idea of what he means by post-human labor. Now, you might say that post-human labor got its start to a certain extent even back in the days of the dark satanic mills that William Blake is talking about in this poem. Factory production generally, especially in earlier times, was dehumanizing and alienating. We all know that. And most of that factory production has now gone overseas. Maybe you might think that Blanchette is talking about the fact that in the United States, this is one area where that type of factory production still exists and it still has the same dehumanizing effect. And that's true, I think, but there's more going on in that term post-human labor. Intimate biosecurity refers to the way in which this labor is more alienating and more kind of disturbing or, life altering than even the previous factory labor and the factory labor that goes on in many countries in this world now. This type of mass production of meat involves human beings dealing with other living creatures in a factory-like setting. And I think this is what, when he examines it closely, this is what makes the difference, okay? He says individual porcine lives may be expendable as cheap meat, but intensifying the generative potentials of swine as a species, the vital processes of birth and growth, trumps classical humanist cultural ideas of autonomy, freedom, and privacy. Most of what I'm going to talk about today involves autonomy and privacy. And by implication, you'll see why it would affect freedom. Okay. Now, again, previous, like the Industrial Revolution factory would definitely have impinged upon these humanistic values. However, this type of production ramps it up, and it's still going on in the United States today. And of course, it's way more high tech, but that has not really diminished, but actually ramped up the dehumanizing and degrading effects of it. So there's some really interesting stuff going on here. He says that human-pig interaction, which goes on throughout this process, species-to-species interaction, is highly monitored and regimented, as it would be in order to produce a very standardized pork, standardize the process, make it as efficient as possible. The pig is fragmented in the process, and it's fragmented into various functions. So whereas a natural pig, you might say, like let's say a wild boar, gets born, grows up, roots around, eats, feeds himself, finds a female, procreates on his own. The female over here gives birth on her own. The little critters then go off and cause untold damage in Texas. You don't really need humans at all. The only time human beings come into the life of wild boar is when human beings are trying to hunt them because they become a very invasive species in states like Texas. So these factory pigs they've been bred to be pretty much a completely different type of animal. And some of them are bred and kept specifically for the pheromones that they can create, which stimulate the sows to be more productive when they're inseminated. And people collect the pheromones, or they parade the pheromone-bearing boar through, the stalls. There's no natural behavior there. Sows are bred for ovulation. Boars are used for the harvesting of semen, and human beings do it. Human beings artificially impregnate the sows, okay? Human beings birth the piglets instead of that happening in a natural process. They often induce them with drugs so that they're born on time before the shift is over. Human beings nurse and feed the pigs, and these pigs are bred to depend and need these things. Okay? The enterprise necessitates changes in human behavior every step of the way. Because the pigs are fragmented, the people are also fragmented, both in work, because they work in different stations and only do one thing typically. Like there are people whose sole job is to deal with the pheromones. Okay. The fragmentation of work in the factory setting produces a fragmentation outside in the so-called private life that isn't very private because of biosecurity considerations. Lots of times people have to think about whether and how to interact with others who work in a different part of the plant, and sometimes are prohibited from biosecurity from living with others who work in a particularly sensitive part of the plant. So you begin to get a picture here of like this symbiotic relationship. I was trying to think of like animals with symbiotic relationships, and the ant and the aphid are one of those pairs. Ants milk aphids, and aphids need to be milked. And so the two species get along well together and need each other, kind of like necessarily. Now, for human beings at this point in time, the pig, this ironic because it's being killed for meat, but the industrial pig needs human beings even more than the human beings need the pig. All the human beings need the pig, obviously, because we need to feed people this cheap pork. People need to have jobs. So, I mean, there's a dependency there, but it's not maybe as strong as the dependency of the weak and unnatural pig having to rely on humans every step of the way from birth to death. Literally, he says, pigs become specialized creatures in this setting, incapable of unassisted living. Humans are trained to move just the right way and avoid actions that would startle the pigs. One of the things that you read about in the first part of the book deals with how pigs are inseminated. And they don't, as I said, they don't let the boars do that. They harvest the semen ahead of time. And then workers simulate the mounting of the boar as they inseminate the sow. So workers have to learn the right moves to make in order to kind of stimulate the sow so she's extremely receptive for insemination, because that matters as to how likely it is that the insemination will take. Every step of the way, workers have to do things of a physical nature in which they relate to the sows and boars in a way that conforms to those creatures' natures. And I think that Blanchette thinks there's something rather distorting here and damaging potentially to human beings who are put into that kind of position where they're stepping in for what would normally be done by a sow or a boar independently. He says human laborers are being turned into external prosthetics for hogs by taking on physiological functions that used to be autonomous. And as I said, one of the consequences is that sociality is affected. And I got to thinking about the larger picture here of, this factory comes to a town or is invited by the town because it's one of their only means of staying alive, basically. It takes over. It's pretty much by far the number one employer. And at least that employs people, although it distorts their community in a lot of ways by fragmenting them as well. And it distorts the way different classes of people view each other. But at least people have jobs. But if the company somehow finds a better way to do what it does or wants to do it someplace else, that community is even less likely to survive than maybe in the past, simply because so much of people's lives have been regulated by the factory and its demands that there may not be as much community there to begin with. So just like the company town of old, a ghost town might be the result. I got to thinking about what's the next step in pork production and getting all sci-fi. I thought about the fact that the ideal would be to produce pork without pigs, literally like laboratory grown meat, which we all know they're certainly trying to do. And if you could produce laboratory grown meat, you wouldn't need to house your whatever factory you had in Iowa where there's lots of corn or whatever. You could do it anywhere, and the result might very well be a ghost town. And it's quite likely that, yes, of course, people would be discarded along with any of the pigs that remain. The last thing I wanted to mention is there's a phrase that's used by one of the workers that Alex talks to, Somos Puercos, which means we are pigs. And the way that she said it, the context in which she said it, led me to believe that what she was saying is we are being treated like pigs, or we are pigs in the process, or we are like these industrial pigs. And I got to thinking about all the ways in which the worker might feel himself, the ones that work on the the barn floor or the factory floor, the meat processing people, and the way that they're treated and how low their pay is, how they might feel like the very pigs that they are processing. And I thought about terms like consumable, dirty, because of course pigs are seen by society as this dirty animal. Actually, as I understand it, pigs are fairly intelligent, but they like to wallow, and this is why they get the reputation for this. And so when we want to call somebody a bad name, sometimes we call them a pig because of this dirtiness aspect. They're expendable. We've seen that they're fragmentable. So are the people, or so they feel and are treated. They're cheap. They're paid cheaply to produce cheap meat. They have to do labor that's so difficult and so demanding and trying that there is an incredible amount of turnover, and that it's easy to replace them, apparently. Some of the work is degrading. And, we see in the book that people come up with creative ways to try to psychologically escape the degrading aspect of the work. They are dependent for their livelihoods on this work. In most of these towns, it would be difficult to find any other work. Because of that, they are vulnerable and also short-lived, just like the pigs. People who do this kind of work and make this kind of money don't live as long and don't live as well, just like the factory animals that they're working on. So I guess I just want to leave you with that thought to contemplate how this symbiosis has developed, and there's more and more of a likeness between those who work with these factory pigs, these industrial hogs, and the pigs themselves who've been bred and are used for the sole purpose of meat production.